October 14, 1883, marked the beginning of a season that would be etched into the memory of the Dakota Territory not for the gold found in the hills, but for the bitter lesson delivered by the frost. The sky was a bruised shade of purple, hanging low and heavy over the plains, signaling an early end to the autumn grace. While the other ranchers in the valley were busy driving their cattle toward the lower pastures and reinforcing the siding on their barns, Silas Vance was engaged in a labor that baffled the community. He was not looking up at the threatening clouds or out at the horizon. He was looking down, driving a spade into the hardening earth with a rhythmic, obsessive intensity. Silas was a man of few words and even fewer friends, a figure who moved with the stiff, deliberate gait of someone who had spent a lifetime walking against the grain. On this particular afternoon, the soil was resisting him, the top layer already crusted with the first kiss of the coming freeze. Yet he continued to dig, carving out a rectangular maw in the ground 50 yards behind his modest cabin. To the casual observer, it looked less like a foundation for prosperity and more like the preparation for a mass burial. It was this grim resemblance that drew the attention of Coulter, the region's wealthiest cattleman, who reined in his horse at the edge of Silas's property. Coulter sat high in his saddle, a man accustomed to looking down on the world, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He watched Silas heave a shovel-load of dark dirt over his shoulder before speaking, his voice cutting through the crisp air. "The ground is freezing, Vance," Coulter announced, his tone dripping with a feigned concern that masked deep condescension. "Most men are boarding up windows and you are digging a hole. Are you planning to die before the snow hits? Or are you just burying your common sense?" Silas paused, leaning on the handle of his shovel, his breath pluming in the cold air like dragon smoke. He looked up, his eyes narrowing not from the sun, but from a resolve that Coulter could not comprehend. "The cold only kills what is left exposed," Silas replied, his voice gravelly and flat. "I intend to harvest while you freeze," Coulter laughed, a harsh, barking sound that startled his horse. "Harvest? In December? You'll harvest ice, Vance." Nothing more, he spurred his horse and galloped away, leaving Silas alone with the dirt and the deepening twilight. The isolation did not bother Silas. In fact, the skepticism of men like Coulter was a necessary component of his fuel, a reminder that vision is often mistaken for madness until the moment it becomes genius. The excavation continued for weeks, moving past the realm of simple digging into the territory of engineering. Silas was not merely making a hole. He was constructing a sanctuary. He understood the geothermal principles of the earth long before they were written in textbooks available in the territory, knowing that below the frost line, the earth maintained a constant, tempered embrace regardless of the blizzard raging above. He dug 6 feet down, then widened the chamber to 20 feet by 40 feet, shoring up the walls with heavy stones he had hauled from the riverbed during the summer months. The physical toll was immense, his hands becoming permanent claws of blister and callus, but the architecture of the underground chamber was precise. He laid thick timber beams across the top, creating a roof that was flush with the ground level, which he then covered with 2 feet of soil and sod, leaving only a small, reinforced trapdoor for entry and a series of narrow, hollowed-out wooden pipes that acted as ventilation shafts. These chimneys were crucial. They would allow the stale air to escape and fresh oxygen to cycle in without letting the freezing temperatures penetrate the sanctum. Inside the bunker, the air was heavy and smelled of damp earth, a stark contrast to the biting, sterile wind that had begun to whip across the plains. It was a dark, silent womb. During one of his trips to the local sawmill to collect sawdust, he encountered Mercer, a supplier who provided grain and basic tools to the ranchers. Mercer watched Silas load the wagon with what most considered waste, shaking his head with a mixture of pity and confusion. "Silas," Mercer said, stepping out onto the loading dock, "the town is talking. They say you've built a crypt. Coulter says you've lost your mind and that we'll be pulling your frozen body out of that hole come spring." Silas tightened the strap on the wagon, checking the tension before turning to the merchant. "Let them talk, Mercer," Silas said, climbing onto the buckboard seat. "A crypt is for the dead. This is for the living. Keep a sack of flour aside for me in January. I'll pay you in fresh produce." Mercer chuckled nervously, wiping his hands on his apron. Produce? In January? If you manage that, Silas, I'll eat my own boots. Silas didn't smile. He simply snapped the reins, the wagon lurching forward, carrying the raw materials for a miracle that no one else could see. With the structure complete, the true alchemy began. The interior of the underground farm was lined with rows of deep wooden troughs, built from rough-hewn planks. To the uninitiated, the contents of these troughs would have seemed repulsive, a mixture of cured horse manure, straw, and gypsum. Silas had spent months collecting the manure from the very stables where men like Coulter kept their prize stallions, offering to clean the stalls for free, a task that earned him sneers and confirmed his status as a desperate pauper in the eyes of the community. They did not understand that he was gathering gold. He spent days in the dim light of the bunker, mixing the substrate, ensuring the moisture content was perfect, damp as a wrung-out sponge, but never wet. He heated water in a large cauldron outside, hauling buckets of steam down the ladder to pasteurize the soil, killing off competitive molds and bacteria. It was a scientific process performed with the tools of a peasant. Once the compost had cooled, Silas introduced the spawn, blocks of mycelium he had carefully cultivated from cultures ordered from a catalog back east months prior. He crumbled the white, web-like substance into the dark, pungent earth, mixing it with the tenderness of a father tucking in a child. Above ground, the world was preparing for a celebration. The first heavy snow had fallen, covering the scars of the land in a blanket of white. The town was filled with the sounds of fiddles and the smell of roasting beef, a final indulgence before the lean months. Silas, however, remained underground, monitoring the temperature of his soil. He checked the simple mercury thermometer he had hung on a support beam. 55 degrees. Perfect. While the cattle outside huddled together, their breath freezing on their muzzles, the mycelium in the dark began to run, sending out millions of microscopic threads, colonizing the manure, digesting the straw, and preparing to fruit. He was farming a fungus, an organism that thrived on decay, turning death into life. It was the ultimate irony. While the ranchers relied on animals that required vast amounts of feed and open land, Silas was creating food from waste in a space no larger than a root cellar. He sat on an overturned crate in the darkness, listening to the muffled howl of the wind above, a captain secure in his submarine while the storm raged on the surface. December arrived with a violence that shocked even the oldest settlers. The temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero and stayed there, a relentless, crushing cold that turned the landscape into iron. The snow did not stop. It piled in drifts against the sides of cabins, blocking doors and burying fences. The cattle, Coulter's pride and joy, began to suffer. Despite the hay stored in the barns, the sheer intensity of the cold sapped their energy, and the weaker calves began to drop, their bodies freezing solid within hours of death. The roads to the nearest supply depot were impassable, severed by walls of white. In the town, the mood shifted from festive to fearful. Firewood supplies were dwindling faster than anticipated, and the game had vanished, driven south or deep into hibernation. But 20 feet below the surface of Silas's land, a different season was in bloom. The heat generated by the composting manure, combined with the insulating power of the earth, kept the underground chamber at a steady, humid 58 degrees. Silas moved through the rows with a lantern, the soft yellow light revealing a transformation. The surface of the dark soil was no longer black. It was pinned with thousands of tiny white knots. They were pinheads, the first stage of the mushroom fruit body. Within days, they doubled in size, swelling into perfect, ivory buttons. The air in the bunker was rich and earthy, smelling of rain and forests, a scent that was completely alien to the sterile, frozen world above. Silas harvested the first flush, his knife slicing cleanly through the thick stems. He filled a bushel basket with the firm, white caps, their gills a delicate pink underneath. He held one up to the lantern light, examining its perfection. It was dense, nutritious, and full of water, a source of life grown from the very refuse the town had mocked. He felt a profound sense of vindication, a quiet warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. He was not just surviving, he was thriving. He cooked a pan of them over his small stove in the cabin, the savory aroma filling the small room, a sharp contrast to the stale hardtack and dried venison that was the standard fare for his neighbors. By mid-January, the situation in the valley had turned critical. The supply lines remained cut, and the general store was stripped bare of flour, beans, and dried fruit. Families were rationing their remaining food, and the specter of starvation, usually a distant fear, was now sitting at every dinner table. The pride that had defined the autumn was replaced by a hollow-eyed desperation. Coulter's herd had been decimated, the losses catastrophic. One evening, as the wind screamed against the siding of Silas's cabin, a heavy, frantic pounding shook his door. Silas opened it to find Mercer, the supplier, standing on the threshold. The man was wrapped in layers of wool and fur, but his face was gaunt, his skin gray and chapped from the cold. He looked nothing like the jovial merchant who had laughed at the wagon of sawdust. "Silas," Mercer gasped, stumbling into the warmth of the room as the wind tried to rip the door from its hinges. "We have nothing. The pass is blocked for another week at least. The widow Jenkins has no food for her kin. My own shelves are dust." He looked around the cabin, his eyes landing on the basket of mushrooms sitting on the table. They were piled high, gleaming white and impossible, like pearls found in a desert. Mercer stared at them, his mouth slightly open, unable to process the sight of fresh, succulent vegetation in the heart of a killing winter. "Is that," Mercer stammered, pointing a trembling finger, "is that real?" Silas closed the door, shutting out the roar of the blizzard. He walked to the table and picked up a large mushroom, tossing it to Mercer. The merchant caught it, feeling its weight, its texture, the coolness of its skin against his feverish palm. It was firm, not frozen. It was alive. Mercer brought the mushroom to his nose, inhaling the scent of damp earth and summer rain, a smell that triggered a primal, watering ache in his jaw. He took a bite, the raw flesh crunching softly, releasing a mild, nutty flavor that tasted like salvation. He chewed slowly, tears welling in his eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of the body recognizing sustenance. "It's fresh?" Mercer whispered, the disbelief still coloring his tone. "How is it possible?" "The ground is iron, Silas. Everything is dead." Silas moved to the stove, pouring a cup of hot water for the shivering man. "The ground is only dead on the surface," Silas answered, his voice calm, devoid of the arrogance that Coulter would have displayed in a reversed situation. "Below, it keeps its promises. I have 300 pounds ready for harvest. Take the basket. Take as much as the sled can carry." Mercer looked up, the juice of the mushroom on his lip. "I can't pay you what they're worth. Not now. The town has no coin, only debt." Silas shook his head, turning back to the window where the white void pressed against the glass. "I didn't grow them for gold, Mercer. I grew them because I knew this winter was coming. Gold doesn't fill a belly. Take them to the widow. Take them to the church. Feed them." They spent the next hour loading the sled Mercer had dragged through the drifts. The wind howled like a wounded animal, trying to snatch the baskets from their hands, but they secured the cargo under heavy tarps. As Mercer disappeared into the white swirl, dragging the lifeline of the town behind him, Silas felt the quiet satisfaction of a theorem proven true. The skepticism of the autumn had been buried under 6 feet of snow. All that remained was the undeniable reality of survival. The arrival of the mushrooms in the town square was akin to a religious event. Mercer had set up a makeshift distribution center in the back of the general store, the only building with a stove large enough to keep the ambient temperature above freezing. Word spread through the community with a speed that defied the lethargy of starvation. Men and women, wrapped in every scrap of wool and leather they owned, shuffled through the drifts, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. When Mercer pulled back the tarp, revealing the mounds of white caps, a collective gasp sucked the air from the room. It was a visual shock, a stark incongruity. Plump, gleaming vegetation in a world of gray ice and black soot. They did not question the source. Hunger had eroded their pride and their skepticism. A large pot was set to boil, and soon the rich, savory aroma of mushroom soup wafted out into the street, a siren song that cut through the biting wind. It was into this scene that Coulter arrived. The cattle baron looked like a shadow of his former self. His coat hung loosely on his frame, and his once booming voice was reduced to a rasp. He had lost 40 head of cattle the night before, their frozen carcasses stiff monuments to his lack of foresight. He pushed through the crowd, his eyes locking onto the steaming ladle that Mercer was using to serve the widow Jenkins. Coulter stood there, the smell of the broth assaulting his senses, his stomach cramping with a violence that nearly brought him to his knees. He saw Silas standing in the corner, leaning against a barrel of nails, watching the scene with a stoic expression. Coulter approached him, the distance between them feeling like miles. "You," Coulter croaked, his pride fighting a losing battle with his biology. "This is your doing?" "The hole in the ground." Silas nodded once, slowly. "The hole you laughed at, Coulter." The grave Coulter stared at the soup, then back at Silas. "I was wrong," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. "My herd is dying. My men are weak. I need." Silas didn't let him finish. He gestured to the pot. "Eat. The earth doesn't care about your pride, and neither do I. Survival is a shared burden." To truly understand the magnitude of the miracle, Coulter demanded to see the source. It was not enough to eat the fruit. His mind, trained in the brutal logic of the frontier, needed to comprehend the mechanism. A week later, during a brief lull in the storm, Silas led Coulter and 2 other prominent ranchers across the frozen expanse of his property. The snow was waist-deep, and the wind bit at their exposed skin, but Silas moved with purpose. He stopped at the small, unassuming trapdoor that protruded from a mound of snow, the only evidence of the structure beneath. "This is it?" one of the ranchers asked, wheezing. "It looks like a badger den." Silas ignored him, clearing the snow and unlocking the heavy padlock. He opened the hatch, and immediately, a plume of warm, moist air rose up to meet them, condensing instantly in the frigid atmosphere like the breath of a living giant. "Down," Silas commanded. He descended the ladder first, lighting the lanterns that hung from the beams. Coulter followed, his boots clunking heavily on the rungs. As he reached the bottom, he stopped, his mouth falling open. The transition was jarring. Above, it was a screaming white hell. Below, it was a silent, humid sanctuary. The temperature was a balmy 58 degrees. The smell was intense, rich, loamy, and sweet. But it was the sight that silenced them. Row after row of wooden shelves stretched into the gloom, teeming with life. Thousands of white mushrooms burst from the dark soil, crowded together in a display of abundance that seemed impossible. Silas walked to a trough, picking up a handful of the compost. "Horse manure," Silas said, holding it out to Coulter. "From your stables. The waste you paid me to haul away, mixed with straw and gypsum. The heat comes from the decay. The earth holds it in. It creates its own season." Coulter stared at the dirt in Silas's hand, then at the lush crop. The irony was a physical weight. He had provided the very fuel for his neighbor's success, discarding it as filth while Silas saw it as energy. "You turned shit into silver," Coulter whispered, running a hand along the rough timber of the support beam. "We are freezing to death protecting cows that are dying, and you are down here warm, growing food in the dark." The winter of 1883 dragged on with a relentless malice, testing the limits of human endurance. The initial relief of the harvest had settled into a routine of survival. Silas's underground farm became the beating heart of the community. Every 3 days, he and a rotating crew of men would brave the surface to harvest the mature caps, hauling baskets of the fungus to the town. The mushrooms became the staple of the diet, boiled into stews, fried in the last dregs of tallow, or dried on racks near the stoves to be ground into a flour substitute. The nutrition they provided, protein and essential minerals, staved off the scurvy and malnutrition that usually accompanied such prolonged isolation. The dynamic of the valley had shifted irrevocably. The hierarchy of wealth, determined by head of cattle and acreage, had been dismantled by the frost. Silas, the man with the smallest plot and the strangest ideas, was now the undisputed leader of the effort. Men who had previously looked through him now looked to him, asking about ventilation, about soil composition, about the signs of the weather. He taught them without arrogance, explaining the principles of insulation and the life cycle of the fungi. He showed them how to monitor the humidity and how to sterilize the substrate. In the evenings, huddled around the stove in the general store, the talk was no longer of cattle drives and market prices, but of root cellars and thermal mass. Coulter, stripped of his bravado, became one of Silas's most diligent students. He spent hours in the bunker, helping to mix the next batch of compost, his hands stained dark with the earth. He worked in silence, a penance for his hubris. The bunker was more than a farm. It was a classroom where the harsh laws of nature were taught not with a whip, but with a spore. They learned that adaptability was superior to brute strength, and that foresight was the only currency that mattered when the sky turned black. The grave Coulter had mocked had become the ark that carried them through the deluge of snow. When the thaw finally arrived in late March, it came with the sound of dripping water, a symphony that was sweeter than any music. The snow retreated, revealing a landscape scarred and brown, littered with the bones of the cattle that hadn't survived. The losses were staggering. Nearly half the herds in the valley had perished, but the people remained. They emerged from their cabins, pale and thin, but alive. The mud was deep and treacherous, but the air held the promise of spring. Silas stood by the trapdoor of his underground farm, watching the sun break through the cloud cover for the first time in weeks. The ventilation pipes, which had breathed steam all winter, stood like sentinels over the muddy mound. Coulter rode up, his horse stepping carefully through the slush. He didn't look down from the saddle this time. He dismounted and walked to where Silas stood. "The pass is open," Coulter said, his voice steady. "Supplies are coming in from the south. Flour, sugar, seeds." Silas nodded, looking out at the horizon. "Good. The soil will need time to recover before we can plant grain." Coulter took off his hat, turning it in his hands. "I'm rebuilding the barn," he said, looking at the ground. "But I'm digging a cellar first. A big one. I was wondering if you'd come over and take a look at the spot. Tell me if the drainage is right." It was a surrender, absolute and total. The request was an admission that the old ways had died in the snow, and a new wisdom had taken root. Silas looked at his neighbor, seeing the change in the man's eyes. The mockery was gone, replaced by a hard-won respect. "I'll come by tomorrow," Silas said. "Get the manure ready. We'll need it." As Coulter rode away, Silas looked back at his subterranean field. He knew the mushrooms would keep growing in the dark, silent and steady, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, life finds a way if you have the vision to build a home for it. The neighbors had laughed, but the harvest had silenced them, proving that genius is simply the ability to see the spring while standing in the dead of winter.